It wasn't about my child, it was about me. And that was a surprise. That's what my guest today, Neha Ruch, said to me about the moment when she decided to step away from her high powered career and the financial security that came with it to be at home with her young son. She didn't expect to feel something she hadn't felt in years: belonging. Not productivity, not prestige, just presence. She said about that moment, he, speaking of her young son, he just wanted to be exactly who I am. Greetings, this is Carl, and you are listening to another episode of 50 Fires, a podcast about money and purpose. And today, my guest is Neha Ruch. Neha is the founder of Mothers United, a platform that's redefining what it means to pause your career for family. Her new book is called The Power of Pause: How to Ditch the Guilt, Own Your Worth, and Design a Life that Works for You. And in this conversation, we cover a lot of ground. We talk about the impact of immigrant stories, invisible and silent labor, and what it means to actually craft a relationship with money that works for you and your family. So without further ado, let's dive into my conversation with Neha Ruch. Neha, where I would love to start is probably at the beginning. Uh, I'm curious, what's your earliest memory of money?
Mm, Great question. Um, I was very attuned to how much money my parents had or didn't have. We immigrated to this country when I was 3 years old,
Mm.
and we had very, very little at the time. So I knew how much my dad was making any given month. And we lived in a tiny studio apartment on the sort of the wrong side of the tracks, and we were sort of all sleeping on the sleeping bag, and then we would move eventually, and every year we would move to larger apartment,
Hmm.
by one bedroom, and then it was two bedrooms, and then eventually it was like this little condo. And I remember the number. I remember when the purchase price on that townhouse, when we moved into a townhouse, and not in New York City, by the way, like a townhouse in a tiny suburb. And it sounded so impressive to me, and I thought, okay, we made it, we're comfortable.
Hey, Carl here. This story about Neha's family's journey as immigrants, from sleeping on the floor in sleeping bags in the studio apartment to this idea, and I loved the visual here of literally moving across the tracks. One moment really stood out to me though, and it was this idea of choice. When her father chooses to stay in the United States and build a life here. That word choice kept echoing as we were talking. The real luxury wasn't necessarily the income, it's the agency. And this theme comes back later when Neha reframes stay at home parenting. The goal isn't, the goal is not leisure. The goal is self determined time.
And I was very attuned to sort of that, how what my dad made in any given year. Um, we didn't have a babysitter.
Did you know that? Like, did you know the number?
I did. I did.
Well, how did you know that? Like, how did you learn that?
I asked.
Oh, really? So you asked your parents, like, how much do you make?
Yes. Yes, I
Wow.
did. I was really I was also I was going to say my parents immigrated here, and part of immigrating here is, yes, you might have less money when you were sort of building. My dad was building a tech company at the time, and but part of it was also that they didn't have the same sort of childcare supports, or village as people call it. So I was
Mm.
at the dinner. I was with them they were bringing a lot of people in to help build this company. So our dinners were really like a human resources meeting with like the various immigrants that were coming to help build this company. So part of it was I was just at the table.
Wow. Where, I mean, I've got so many questions about this. Where do you think you use the word attuned? Where do you think that came from?
Mm, insecurity.
Oh, come on. Like, tell me more about that.
Yeah. I think I was very aware of the have and have nots, and I was
Hmm.
lucky. I think, when we came to this country, my town, which by the way, I feel like I end up talking about this town I grew up in a way that, gives it a bad rap. It is a beautiful town. My closest friends still, live there or have family there. It was a predominantly white town, so I was already sort of feeling on the inside of it. And there was
Mm.
literally a train track down the middle where there's sort of the more working class, or the temporary homes, and then the more sort of whitewashed, like white picket fence neighborhoods, right? And we would eventually move across the track. I was probably, let's say I was 13 when we made that move. And I watched my parents sort of build their life. It was literally, I mean, when I tell you it was often manifested in home, I think home is really important to me. Houses are really important to me. How we curate our homes are really important,
Mm.
still. But the spaces sort of just grew. And with that, I knew sort of how safe I felt, and sort of my safety in my community, how people reacted to my parents, how people reacted to me changed. I watched that change. I watched, and by the way, like, it's a skewed data set because I also was sort of more established in the country just by sheer nature of the years that I was spending in the country. So, we probably lost our accents a little bit, and there's more
Mm.
assimilation. So there's a lot of
Mhm.
factors. It's not just financial. Um, but I think that there was a sense of belonging that I associated with a number of things. One, your skin color, and two, your economic status.
Mm.
Um, I was also, it was the early 80s, and you will
Mm.
remember that there was a lot of concern around immigrants taking jobs, especially in that part of the country. um, because of sort of the academia, because of Harvard and MIT, and so there was a lot of tech and so there was a lot that was wrapped up in that
Mm.
whole interplay with work and money, not having too much, not having too little, that I was aware of. I also overthink for a living, so I was
Mm.
doing that very early on. So let's
Right.
just say that.
No, but it's so interesting to me that I mean, there's so much about that. The idea of knowing I'm curious if you could just maybe walk me through how you said we made it. Like you could
Mm,
remember the feeling at a certain point of like we made it. And then also
mm,
that you quickly identified insecurity is super like aware and fascinating to me. Like, can you remember a moment or a story or maybe even a feeling of like, oh, how did you know you made it? Like how, and I don't mean,
mm.
you already said like the houses, or the spaces got a little bigger or you felt more secure, but can you remember the feeling or an experience or a story that would be helpful?
Whoa, I remember I was 9 years old, and my dad was working for a company. He had come over, he had sort of built the North American branch of a very large, what's now a large Indian tech company called Infosys. And
Hmm.
he had a choice. We were going to return to India and build a sort of life with it, continuing on with Infosys, and they sort of to sell me on this, they showed me the pamphlets of the apartment we were going to live in.
Mm.
And this was in a city called Bangalore, which was sort of like the Silicon Valley of India. The
Hmm.
private school I would attend, right? This is all very different than what my life was like. And um, And I'm sitting there in this in Great Road Apartments, and it has that, this terrible like brown carpet that I'm sitting there
Hmm.
looking at that and looking at the life, and we ended up choosing to stay because my father had was offered to build a subsidiary of Infosys, which he went on to build. And I remember feeling like, wow, choice. Like that
Wow.
I was aware of the choice. I actually have my journal entry that I showed my
Wow.
son the other day. And we moved to that townhouse in Nagog Woods, which makes it sound like very fancy. It was $124,000 was that house. And it was the first home we bought, right? And this idea of choice and permanence
Mm.
felt really interesting to me.
Mm.
Interesting. I'm giving it that word. I didn't think it was interesting. I thought it was like a real luxury that we were choosing.
Yeah. Yeah. If that's amazing. Thank you for that. Like that idea of
Mm-hmm.
being aware of like, whoa, we get to choose. That's come up a
Right.
lot in these conversations. The idea of like the
Right.
freedom to make a choice.
Right. And it's the first time I've verbalized it. And it's so much a part of the work that I do now.
How I'm curious about that. How have you, just real quickly before we move on, how have you seen that sort of carry through those early experiences around security and money and having made it and freedom to choose? How have you seen that carry through your work ever since?
Uh, a couple things. I think one, of course, my work, I came upon it because I chose to initially downshift and then pause my career, right?
Mm.
Um, and oftentimes people assume that I did that because, I can't, I really wanted time with my kids. And I did, I really did. I really loved being with my son. I really would, but it was more that when I was with him in those sort of first months, I, for the first time, felt like a sense of belonging. Like I felt like,
Hmm.
I don't have to try so hard. He just wants me to be exactly who I am. And there was a sense of freedom I felt in that. And maybe a sense of security I felt in that after, I'd sort of gone through my upbringing, which we can get into, but, and then through my 20s where got a lot, like so many of us, early 30s, in like lots of self-worth and belonging in what I do for work, how much I was paid. And then I had him, and there was this real sense of like comfort in my own skin. And so when I chose to make more room for that, I didn't do that because I thought it was going to be a better outcome for him. I did it because I think I was really curious about this new,
Hmm.
like what my day to day was going to look like and this new version of me. And so I always say that because I don't think I don't ever want people to think that a pause is the right choice for their family.
Mm.
It's a choice and it's valid and
Mm.
respected, but there's plenty of happy and healthy outcomes for children. I made that choice for myself because it was the right one for me.
Mm.
I also think it comes up a lot in the dialogue around, with a lot of this work is about rebranding stay-at-home motherhood, right? And stay-at-home motherhood, because it's a phrase that for a lot of sociolinguistics reasons is so flawed and so doesn't align to the reality of modern women. But beyond that is, I think it conjures up this idea of lady of leisure, and it's a luxury. And the
Mm.
biggest way women, or biggest way this work has been attacked, not attacked, attacked, everyone has been so generous over, but one of the sort of holes as well, it's a luxury. It's a luxury to get to choose. And there's always a part of me that cringes because my mother was an at-home parent and she didn't have the luxury to get to choose, right? She was forced to do it for a number of circumstances. And by the way, I think I think she was probably the biggest critic of my choice because she saw she didn't ever want me to feel like I was put in that position, but we were coming at it in two such different ways, right? But all the data in the world, and we commissioned a survey around this as well with Proof Insights, a research firm in Maryland. 1 in 3 women feel forced to pause because of the cost of
Mm.
childcare. 60% say financial considerations. And that's not to say working out of the home is a luxury. It's to say the real privilege is to get to choose. And that just goes back to, I think that's what we sort of dismiss is that luxury. The real luxury is choosing how we spend our time.
Mm. Yeah, there's a great conversation that you had with your husband
Mm,
about luxury that I want to get to in a
poor
minute. So
guy.
let's, yeah.
Poor
Well, I know.
guy.
Look, I will be super generous in the way we have that conversation because I've had the same. In fact, let's get there
Yeah.
now. We'll come back to because I've had the same. Yeah, one of the things I was excited about in terms of having this conversation is just to talk about some of the unhelpful stereotypes around money. You may be almost bored of talking about them, but they're still so helpful to understand. And this kind of points at one of them,
Mm-hmm.
and it, obviously we want to be super generous to your husband because we've all made some of the, I mean, at
Yeah,
least I know
of
I've made
course.
some of these assumptions. We, I, I've read that, and particularly he had taken sort of a business P&L model to the
Mm,
household.
mm,
Um, and these, I'm curious a little, there's a lot in this question, but these
yeah.
regular Sunday, do I have this right? This regular Sunday admin money meeting.
We still do them. The money meeting's at the top of the year. That's annual. And then we do
Yeah.
a Sunday family admin meeting and then a monthly budget review. And we still do it to this day.
So good. So I want to talk a bit about that if we get there, but I really want to talk about this little conversation that you had. And if I have it right, you had mentioned even the most progressive hands-on partner can
Mm,
sometimes have some of these stereotypes in our thinking. And the statement was staying at home is a luxury.
mm,
And what I read you said about that was no, you going to work without having to worry about a single thing happening at home, that's the luxury.
mm-hmm, mm. Yeah, my husband thinks he needs a byline for this book because of every chapter is inspired by a fight. Can you imagine? Poor guy.
I know, I'm sure, but I only bring that up because it's so prevalent.
Yeah,
And I
yeah.
just want to try and unwind some of those. Like, tell me a little bit about that, and then maybe also any other really common stereotypes that we may be perpetuating without even knowing it.
Yeah. that's I would say that, what's shocking about that is that my husband is one of the most, like I described, progressive. But I also think because I think on one side, what he was very good about was creating that P&L. So
Mm,
even before we had children, we treated our household like the most important organization there was,
mm,
right?
mm,
We were very prescriptive about this is the income in, these are the things we care about, right? These are our budget categories: clothing, dining out, home care, health, therapy. And so we'd allowed ourselves this sort of system to do that. And so he was watching the money in, money out in a very pragmatic way. And he was also seeing that our care line item was very minuscule, right? There was a
mm,
reason for that. Because I was providing that in an unpaid capacity for those years. Uh, I think when he would get home, I remember I did this for a period of time and I cringe thinking about it, but I think it's important.
mm,
I would jump up. I would jump up and start doing things to look
mm,
busy, right?
mm,
Like it was almost like if he walked in and I was sitting down
mm,
and just like looking at my child, then I wasn't actively doing. And we, as it is in this culture, dumb parenting down, right? We dumb it down to like diapers and laundry. But then we also have this sort of fictional caricature. So if you poll the American public to this day, of who do they think of as a stay at home mom?
mm,
They will say June Cleaver, right? June
mm,
Cleaver is a fictional character from the 1950s show Leave It to Beaver. By the way, second to
mhm.
that is Lucy Ricardo, and Lucy didn't even have kids. She's just like a black and white character.
Right, right.
If you ask them with Working Mother, they say Michelle Obama, who by the way had the most like nonlinear career ever, Sheryl Sandberg, and Beyonce. the like
Wow.
power chasm is so great, but you can see that we have this sort of, one of the more interesting things too, and where this trope came from is that in the 1970s, when this sort of power chasm was emerging between working mom, stay-at-home mom, it was also around the time where advertisers were starting to push industrial goods like dishwashers
Mm.
and cake mix. So
Mm.
they were actually selling an easier lifestyle. So we
Mm.
just like associated that image. When, like, if anyone has spent a day with their children, they know that the like emotional, intellectual work that is demanded in that stage of life, while different than in the work capacity, is hugely valuable. But we've just played it down. We've just played it down for so long, and we've sort of let this sort of these tropes haunt us. And my husband, one of the things I think we arrived at after that conversation was, yes, I do depend on the income that you're providing, but that income is coming in because at a drop of a hat you can book a flight. He was running a tech company at the time. You can book a flight to California without even thinking about who's going to be home at, at 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, who's waking up with the kids. And so there's a level of interdependence
Mhm.
that we have in this household. And by the way, the other piece of this is it's not always going to be this way, right?
Mm.
This is what's working for us right now, but it is an interdependent household. And I'm glad we had that dialogue, because we arrived at that language. And obviously I spell out that language in the book, but it was really foundational for us to move forward, because now that I think back to it, it was only after that that I felt compelled to like think about asking for more help, or like sit
Mm.
when he was walking in the door.
Mm. We'll be right back with more from 50 Fires. Welcome back to 50 Fires. Years ago, when I was writing my column at the New York Times, and Twitter was like the
Mm,
early days, back when it was fun.
yeah, it was
Um,
fun.
somebody said, I can't remember who it was. It was some national personal finance person said, this is, I believe I have this verbatim. Being a stay-at-home mom is always a bad decision.
Mm, mm,
And we got into it a little bit just because I said, that's interesting. You should ask my wife.
mm,
Like, does she feel that way? I was like, look, I'll go up and ask her right now, because I think I knew the answer. But it led to this discussion of off, like an emotional balance sheet.
right, right.
Like, I'm the one that gets to decide what we place value. I am the
Mm,
one that I get to decide what I place value on. My wife gets to decide what she places value on. But there might be a line item on our balance sheet that says a parent at home. And
mm-hmm.
in our case, it was my wife had decided to stay home. And I'm actually curious too to talk about the progression of that, because she's now started an interior design firm. And it's
I was
very
just going to
fascinating to
ask.
me.
I was going to
It's
ask
very
how that was
fascinating
going.
for me to feel like us trying to get ground underneath our feet in terms of how do we operate. Like, so anyway, the first thing, are we past that? Do we, you seem to have painted a very lovely sort of nuanced approach of like, it's not the answer, it's an answer. Because
Mm-hmm.
there was this period where it felt like everybody was saying like, no, it's always a bad
Mm,
decision. And I wasn't even sure, when I went back and looked at the numbers, I wasn't even sure it was a bad financial decision for our family for the reason you just pointed to. I could get on a plane tomorrow. I mean, it gave me space to do everything. I'm not sure financially it was a bad decision. And then with her feelings about it, combined with my feelings about it, emotionally, it wasn't I don't think we would change it much.
yeah.
So are we past that? Like, it's always a bad decision? Are we having a different conversation, or what am I missing?
Yeah, no, we're having a different conversation. I think the
Mm.
first conversation is, we really want to move past this sort of black and white idea of
Mm.
stay at home mom. I think the concept is you're taking, one parent is taking a pause in their career for a chapter of time to do care work, to elder care work, right? 84% of millennials will take a career break. So this is like a reality for everyone. And by the way, 1 in 5 stay-at-home parents right now are dads. So it's not just gendered, which I think is really interesting, right? As women have sort of risen in their earning potential, and childcare costs have gone up. But I think the biggest piece is there's more options on the table. Even since I started this work, I started this as a project alongside Family Life 9 years ago, and I can tell you that the freelance economy has boomed in
Mm-hmm.
that time. I mean, part of that was the pandemic accelerated remote work options. I think as more women and men started their own small business and then started employing fractional work, I keep joking that I initially downshifted into part-time work. There was no fractional, like you didn't get to call it fractional, but now you do. I went and updated my LinkedIn and it was like I was a fractional head of marketing. Who
Right.
knew?
Right.
Um,
Right.
but
So hip.
I think we've just blurred those lines in such a big way. We've also put,
Mm.
we're looking at, we talked a little bit about the tropes that haunt women or men who take a career pause, but for the sake of this conversation, we'll talk about women, right? And it was this idea that you were shut in, that you were sort of traditionalist, that you were giving up and your career was over. And I think that was a lot of where the risk came from. It was that you were cutting yourself off from all future earning potential. You were putting yourself in an incredibly vulnerable position from a
Mm.
financial perspective. And I think what we're looking at now is the average age of a woman having a baby is 30 and across the country, right? And that
Mm.
includes across the country in a very socioeconomic strata, which means it skews older on the coast, right? You're coming in with so much more education and work experience. You're not like tripping and falling into the well of motherhood. You're coming into it having established some degree of academic and professional foundation. And then you have more hands-on partners, right? This isn't like we're not serving cocktails at the end of the day. Our partners are hands-on. They're spending 3 times the amount of time as any generation previous. And then they have access to all of these digital tools and technology. So in some way, I mean, 90% of women are keeping themselves somewhat engaged, like your wife, Fred. She is not the only one. Everyone is sort of discovering new interests and hobbies, and those networks that we are building, in this sort of informal environments that we're operating in while doing the care work at home tend to lead us back into some professional capacity, right? 90% of women now want to return to the workforce after a pause. So it's just not as sort
Did
of
you say
black and white.
90?
90,
Wow.
90%. Right. And you
Wow.
want to know something else? What's interesting is 1 in 3 women who are currently employed in the traditional workforce are going to pause their careers in the next 2 years. 1 in 2 are going to downshift their careers to 20 hours a week, meaning, and 90% are returning. So it's just so much more fluid. And I think so to the person on Twitter, like, how do we know it's a bad choice for that moment? And if we
Right.
sort of put
Right.
that person in this shame box of like, that was a bad choice, you cut yourself off of career potential and financial opportunity, and now you're in this box over there, we've assigned shame and we've counted her out. And that you were asking, what do we sort of subconsciously do? I think we count women out as soon as they take their foot off the gas.
Mm. Okay. How
So much, I know, so much.
I know so much. Let's just stay here for a minute. I want to go back to those meetings because I want to understand what those look like because it sounds really, really valuable. But first, is this uh, is there a generation like are we in like the like I remember when I didn't have a cell phone.
Same.
Right? Like my kids probably won't remember that. I don't think they'll ever remember it really, other than like, oh, there was that time before I was 8 or whatever. Is this similar? And the question I'm trying to ask is like my daughters are so I've got a daughter in private equity, not only private equity but distressed equity, so the most
Oh
like
boy.
bro part of finance, right? Loves it, is killing it, like loves it. A daughter in med school, a daughter in a biomedical engineering program at a good school, and I'm watching with fascination the interaction with potential boyfriends or partners. And there seems, and I can kind of relate to the feeling of like not quite sure what the ground feels like, because there was this model. It feels a little bit like some political slogan that we hear bandied about, which I'm not even going to mention. Like, can we
Yeah.
go back
Yeah.
to that?
Yeah.
And it's not about, to me, it's not about going back. It's just about like this real empathy for the ground shifting and
Mm-hmm.
sorting out what that means. How do you, especially for, I'm curious about for women that age, 25 to 35, and with partners like you described your husband, like progressive, but still like we don't have a model for it.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody taught me how to do this.
Mm-hmm.
How do you talk to them about, particularly about the money? There's this sense of sometimes emasculation that comes up. Wait, I'm the provider. Like there's a stripped role, and nobody really means, oh man, some people do actually, but I'm not talking about those people. I'm talking about people who really mean like, yes, I want that for you.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm not sure how to talk about it or feel about it or think about it or what my role is. How do you talk about that?
I think language is so important, right? Like, I think the
Yeah.
language that's been handed down to us, then we're rewriting. I mean, so much of the work I do is in scripts because I think that these conversations are so tricky because they are so new, right? Money.
So it's not just me.
No, it's not just you. I
Okay,
think,
thank you.
it was shocking to me how many women said on the tour that they still shy away from money conversations with their partner because it just feels like too intimidating, and if they open it up it's like Pandora's box, and I get that.
Intimidating to them or intimidating to their partner?
Intimidating to their relationship,
Fascinating.
it's just not something they started in doing. And
Mm-hmm.
I offer that I think that it is really, money is a reflection of our values. It's how we,
Mm-hmm.
one of the first conversations, and I think you and I have gone there in this dialogue, so it's interesting. My husband, I know the moment that I knew I was going to marry my husband, we'd actually met because of a tech conference, and we were, of course we did. And we were sitting on at a bar, and we were talking about our parents. And his family also immigrated here from Israel. And we were talking, and they very similarly kind of climbed the socioeconomic ranks, and we reflected on that experience of having lived both experiences, and very specifically that what we appreciated about our families is they didn't live like that. That our mothers were the ones who kept our fathers grounded,
Hmm.
who sort of reminded them that, like, we are not those people. Like, we're not going to live like our mothers are still like trying to shop the distance, like do not have not replaced their clothing in many years. And I think we really valued that about it, but yet they both love to travel, right? Like, that was the thing that connected, and I said, like, oh, this is who I'd build my life with.
Mm. Because of this
Someone who got
value,
it,
a
who's
shared
someone who
value.
understood it, right? Who
Yeah.
understood what travel, like why travel was important, why other things weren't as important, what it felt like to have witnessed both things, because you have a different empathy for people in different socioeconomic strata.
Mm.
Anyways, um, money was just a part of the fabric of our dialogue very early without even realizing it. And I think, I'm not going to say it's romantic, but it's this moment of calibration of, like, what does an ideal life look like for
Mm.
you? What are you willing to trade off on?
Mm.
Right? Because when I talk to couples about this decision, because for a lot of the couples, it was one parent who wanted it, but a lot of couples, it was both parents who just wanted, the top three reasons people pause their careers are: one, a parent has, or both parents have, a very valid want to spend more time with their kids. The second is less stress in the home.
Mm.
And the third is financial considerations. Less stress in the home is a big one because it goes back to an interdependent household. If you're recognizing that if one partner sort of dials down on the career front, it just lets everyone function a little bit more easily.
Mm.
um, and when you're having that conversation together, that is a very values aligned conversation. That's not about, like, how much are you spending on a taxi, let me look over your, like, guilt group membership, whatever. It's really about, what do I envision? And anyways, those couples who make that decision together, I've had couples I've spoken to a couple who it was a big thing. They moved from the Bay Area to Virginia Beach to because
Mm,
for them it was worth it for
mhm,
a smaller cost of living. And for others, it was that we're going to try cut our like travel budget. We're going to have to
mm,
disappoint a lot of people and say we're not going to their bachelor and bachelorette parties. Like, this is more important. And so
mhm.
there's a way in which money can be intimidating, but we need the language to be able to put it early in the
Yeah, can
dialogue.
can you circle back to threatening? Don't have this conversation because it feels threatening.
And
Like maybe a
intimidating.
little bit about why and how do we make it less threatening?
I think people feel like that's where the differences will show.
Huh.
Like, it, I think it's where they may express an unmet need or want,
Mm,
or see a divergence. I think
hmm.
because it is so much about, like, I'll give you one of the questions, like, are you someone who wants to optimize for savings, or would you rather live the way we want to live now and worry about that later? Like, that's a really big freaking question. Like, how do you know,
Yeah.
if
Yeah.
you're 25, if your daughter's having that conversation now, um, it's hard to wrap your head around unless you sort of start big picture
Mm,
and come at it. I always say, like, don't have this conversation like rushing around, like,
right. Right.
at a noisy restaurant. This is a conversation that you might say, like, I really, I want to start this practice because money is something that's been on my mind, and I want to make sure that we both feel safe in it, and that, like, lets me feel like we are a
Mm,
safe partnership, and then that'll let us have more fun and feel better
mm.
as a unit. And these are some of the questions I want to ask. What are some questions you want to ask? um, and I lay those out obviously in the book, but you can come up with your own. But a lot of it is, what am I optimizing for? What am I willing to trade off on?
Yeah.
What's something I wish for that I don't have? How did I grow up? Well, how did my parents spend money?
Yeah.
How did
Yeah.
like, that's a big piece of it. And I think sometimes in couples, that's sometimes where there might be a split. And I think having these conversations, you can actually find when you start at the top, it doesn't have to feel as far away
Yeah.
from one another.
Are there patterns you see about the way men approach these conversations that you're like, oh man, I wish they wouldn't do that? Like, is there any like
Mm.
top three things to not do? Is there anything helpful there that you're like, do you
Oh,
realize that like the fact that you use that word luxury, like to as an example, like
yes.
I remember saying something like soap opera and bonbons.
Oh,
I
oh,
know.
I
I know
know.
that's
I know.
20
And
20
you're
years
very
ago.
progressive. I mean, listen, like, I get it.
I'm terribly embarrassed about it.
Yeah.
But like
Yeah.
that's the same idea. And
Mm-hmm.
I would then say like, no, I'm just kidding. I mean, I know. Right. But are
Mm-hmm.
there I guess the real thing I'm trying to point to is I'm trying to think through how we could help. Well, me would be great, but I'm specifically thinking through 25 to 35-year-old in a relationship where there's a man and a woman and they're trying to sort out this conversation. So you've got all
Mm-hmm.
those traditional things colliding. Like, is there any little things you could be helpful with there?
Yeah. I think one of the number one things is deciding together, right? You're deciding together how it
Mm,
benefits the whole system, right?
mm,
Because it doesn't just benefit one person. It's not just like, oh, mom wants to spend time, like, have this time to, like, hang, with their child and just stare at the child, put the child down, read. So, like, why? Why do why does she
hmm,
want it? Why does he maybe want it? Why might he
mm-hmm,
benefit? Why might the child benefit? What in this particular circumstance? Because it's not oftentimes just when the couple has one child, it's oftentimes when they have two children, any
mm,
transition period. So, adding another child, family relocations.
mm,
Oftentimes, you'll see it around like second and third grade, where you see diagnoses these days crop up
mm,
among kids,
mm,
and the
mm,
child needs extra care, or just attention. And I think the other piece is curiosity around what do you actually spend your day doing? Not from a
mm,
place of judgment of like, what are you going to do all day, right?
mm,
It's more about how do you spend your time what that I don't notice? I think
Mm,
asking that question because, especially I'm thinking about, when you have a 4 and 2 year, 5 and 2 year old, right? Um, you're doing so much of this work that is often it's not just the diapers and the laundry or the like taking children. Oftentimes when people economists sort of break down like this is the role of the stay-at-home parent, and it's like a chauffeur, a nutritionist, a tutor,
right,
like
right,
that's like a sweet way of doing it. And they're like, economists posit that it would cost $184,000 to outsource all these tasks. That's great as like a back number, like just to have in your back pocket and be like, by the way, this is
right,
the number that salary.com came up with. But I think that's like fine as a data entry point. But I think having a more nuanced conversation around, I'm really like here to try and get our family footing into two children and
right,
figure out, what school this child is going to go to and how to make sure that this other child develops a community and a network of friends and peers, and there are age appropriate activities. And I'm researching and planning and trying to build a network for us to be able to lean on. um, and I'm also thinking a lot about how, like, someone's allergy, and I'm out of sitting on the insurance to try and figure out what doctors these kids are covered by. And you really talk about, like, these are some of the things that go unnoticed.
right,
Actually, literally make note of them sometimes when you're like, oh, I didn't even realize that task is taking so much time, right?
right.
Communication with my in laws to make sure that they meet my child so that they have a nice connection. Kin keeping, that's like a real role.
Right,
And
right,
then, so there's this whole piece of, building rhythms and routines to help this family thrive, and systems and research. Like the real work of parenthood, I always say, is like up at night Googling, like,
right.
is my child, like, is there a speech delay? Should I call to say speech therapist and like sit on the phone with the speech therapist, or should I just let it go? Like that, having someone who's taking care of that, that's like highly specialized work, and I think sometimes having that open dialogue and overcoming the very simplification, the like oversimplification is really crucial.
Yeah, and it's like you list all that stuff off. It feels like at the end of it, you just want to say something like, "Try putting a number on that," right? Like that. That's
Mm,
just like it's back to the emotional balance sheet that we had. Like we had put some number, not really, but we had put some value, placed some
right.
value on that experience. Um,
Can I tell you the third piece
yeah,
that
yeah.
why I hesitate with the number? Because we did it too. I mean, obviously there was quite a literal number with like care, um, childcare in New York of what that would cost. And so often that's the math that people arrive at. They're
Yeah,
like, oh,
right,
well, I would pay.
right.
And the reason that that one's tricky, so this is the third pitfall, is that both parents, no one should work 24/7 without breaks. And
Mm,
I fell into the trap. And if I fell into the trap, and we have resources, right? So I fell into the trap that 1 in 3 women at home do, which is if I don't work for pay, then I don't deserve
hmm,
support.
right.
And that gets very tricky very fast, especially if we are trying to set the stage of life up as truly a career pause, not a life pause, right? Meaning that you are still actively growing alongside your kid. You're still investing in your own network and your relationships, even if it's just a little bit a week, right? And so, um, that's part of this is the reason why I spend a lot of time on that upfront foundational work around value the work you're doing, because you both parents deserve to be healthy, whole, and supported. They're still contributing, even in different ways. And I think the sort of idea that you paused your career to be a piggy bank is sort of a flawed, it ends
Mm,
up catching you on the other side.
yeah, that's
and
really smart.
and I interviewed a woman, Helen Ortiz in Napa, who said, she basically took the money she'd allocated for therapy. She had a therapist once a week. She reallocated it to 5 hours of a babysitter a week. And
Mm,
eventually her husband bought into like, oh, this babysitter is actually helping our whole family. Kind of
mm,
like she's lessening the burden on your expectation on me when I walk in on a Thursday, right? And so she's improving the way, and she's helping our children, trust other adults. And so I guess I go back to this idea that even with care, even with that line item, that doesn't just come out of the mom's income or lack of income in this case, right? It comes out of the joint household income. So going back to my husband's P&L, right, the income's in, but it's a joint household income, and then there's a line item for the various sort of the Instacarts, the you know, the cleaning once a week, but it comes out of the joint
Yeah.
household.
So interesting to me, even those, I mean, I remember reading something like unpaid work doesn't deserve help, like
Mm.
an unhelpful belief, right? And the idea that you mentioned, let me just find it real quick. Oh yeah, we decided to move funds away from travel and put more into babysitting was one example you
Mhm.
gave.
Mhm.
And then the idea, even mentioning cleaning,
Right.
like it's so how quickly that taps into some weird puritanical work ethic problem of like, are you serious?
Yeah.
You know, like we're those people.
Oh, 100%. And by the way, I think, I mean, you and I could have this conversation forever. I hope you tackle it in your book, is this idea of privilege. And,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
privilege is so, we weaponize it, right? So
Mm-hmm.
what happens, especially with women in the age of social media,
Mm.
is we're sort of scrolling our feeds, and then we assemble a caricature of what the
Mm.
ideal mother looks like, right? Someone has a clean home, someone has like a really well curated meal, someone else is doing crafts, someone else is like killing it in the workplace. But there's something missing, which is then, their support behind the scenes. So then
Yeah.
we sort of assume we have to do all these things. We put it together in this ideal portrait. And then we don't show the supports or talk about it freely, because as soon as you do, they say, well, I thought
Right.
you were a stay-at-home mom. Like, what are you doing with, a babysitter 15 hours a week, or, a mother's helper doing your life, whatever it is.
Yeah.
And I think we've internalized, and by the way, that just compounds our own belief that, like, oh, like the good mother or the good parent is really trying to do this, like struggling through
Mm-hmm.
it. Like, we do have this very strange, you know, um feeling of where we have to work hard at whatever we're doing, and working hard means like a little bit of suffering, just a little bit, and that's really flawed, and that's really where we sort of arrive at this moment where women then feel like they've stepped into this time that they've shifted to be at home, but they're trying to do all these things, and then they're trying to do it without help. And really the goal would be, you stepped in because you wanted to make room for family life, but you also stepped in to say, and I want to be a whole and healthy person alongside this kid so that I can show up for them. And that means in my house, I'm going to do chicken nuggets a lot,
Remember the
because
chicken
that
nugget
lets me
station?
use naps and night times for self development. And I'm going to get my husband and I have decided we're going to, trade off our mornings, that we get our mornings, or he's going to
Mm.
do evenings. So, it can be unpaid sources of help, it can be paid sources of help, but the goal line is like, you get some time to yourself.
Yeah. So I was just thinking about something I just recently somebody forwarded to me about Scott Galloway talking about this sort of almost like dating partnership crisis. And one of the points he was pointing out was like that really successful, on top of it, women are coming to the conclusion that this is a bad trade. What do you mean? I'm going to like go to
Yeah,
work,
I saw
then I'm going
that.
to come home and do in the way that Scott Galloway would say it, right?
Yeah,
Like that it
yeah.
was a bad trade. But there's something to that idea of like the traditional, I'm going to come home, put my feet up, TV dinner, and a football game. And like we're still unwinding what it means. And I've got a number of friends, and even some of the the the, the boys from the neighborhood that are
Mm-hmm.
my daughter's age that have talked about like I would love to, look, if I'm dating a girl, she's in medical school,
Yeah.
I'd have no problem staying home.
Mm-hmm.
Like, yeah, I totally get the no problem, but it is interesting that's easy to say. It's also very hard to sort of talk about and unwind and sort your way through because it's just such new ground.
Oh, it's so new. I think um, men in this sort of stage of life, I've noticed this with people about 10, 15 years younger, like this next generation, where I've heard that actually a number of times, men talking about stay at home better, taking career breaks. It's really it's different because it really challenges women to think about what do we really want? Like, how are we going to make this, how do we do this in a sustainable way? Because I think we have it sort of makes us stand up and figure out, like, is that the dynamic that we want? Are we
Yeah.
okay with that trade-off? Because that's a big trade-off too, right? And
Yeah.
if you're going to take on, and it's upending in all the different directions. I have a dear friend who's she's the chief commercial officer of Bugaboo. She has a very big job, and her husband is at home, and she says it all the time that he will, the sort of what do you do question that is the
Mm.
universal stumbling block for
Mm-hmm.
women. When he says that he is currently at home with kids, is just met with complete shock and awe.
Mm.
With women, it's like a little bit more of like invisibility, like you're sort of just completely counted out of the dialogue. With him, it's a little bit more of like it takes a beat to register, because that feels like, oh, that's still a lot of, like yet another leap away from where we've been.
Yeah. Neha, before we wrap up, I'd really like to circle back to the meeting. Can
Yeah.
you just sort of like almost like we'll have a little bit of tips and tricks, tactical moment here? Like,
Mm,
how do you, because you've described these meetings, and this is something I've been talking about for years, but there's this business P&L piece,
yeah.
but there's also like this family values money meeting. In fact, I think yeah, you actually called it. We do a meeting that's also a family values meeting.
Mm-hmm.
How do you have that meeting? Like, what does it look like?
We commit a lot of time to it. It's pre-scheduled, so it's always in January. The
Mm.
kids have usually been back at school for like 2 weeks. It's like right before MLK. I don't know why I'm giving you this much detail, but
That's
it,
exactly what
it
I want.
works.
Yeah.
Um, I think it usually comes in. We've had some time together as a family, and so we've observed a little bit about our kids and how our family's functioning. So, we'll talk about what worked the last week. So I will say that you really need one person who loves Excel. And my husband loves Excel, and he really is able to say, this was our target. So we
Mm.
we set targets at the beginning of the year prior of, this is how much income we have in, this is how much spending we forecast, and we break it into pretty great detail. Financial advisors will say, like, it doesn't have to be like so deep. You can just have lump categories like health. It doesn't have to be like therapy, kids
Mm.
doctors. But we have it in travel, gifts, house
Mm.
maintenance. And there are
Mhm.
like some fixed costs. Like we know the house is going to cost us this much. We know our taxes are going to cost us a certain amount. But based on that, we'll sort of see, well, where did our numbers shake out last year?
Mm.
Where were we over? Where were we under? This is usually a good time for my husband to like give me a lecture about Ubers and taxis, and me to give him a lecture on, like, you don't need five of the same T-shirts. Like, you don't need them. But we both have our things, and I think that helps. That we both have
Yeah.
our like things that we know that we grossly underestimate, and then we essentially like clear the sheet for 2025 and say, well, based on where we are, what do we expect? What do we want to plan for? Do we want to continue? I'll give you a very specific example. We really love community building, as you know. And we have a summer party for the entire community, and then we have a fall Friendsgiving party.
Mm.
And it, those things add up. They're significant, and it's a big investment. Um, do we want to do that again this year? And if so, we put it under the entertaining piece, because community is our like a big value, and we move it away from travel for this year,
Mm.
right? For example, we'll say, you know what,
Mm.
we'll take that one trip with my parents,
Mm.
and we won't necessarily do that extra thing in the summer, because it's not, we're happy and that we don't need more in that
Mm.
capacity. So you can see how we're making a slight tweak, but we're moving things across the budget, because the income's not changing in our case. But where might we shift our spending? I think the one other thing that we try and leave room for is, how is our work working for
Hmm.
us?
Hmm.
Is my husband comfortable in the role that he's playing right now? Am I comfortable with, I'm making a little income again? Am I comfortable with that level? Do I need to dial up? Do I need to minimize costs? Like what, are we it's basically to get buy-in that we both feel confident in each
Mm,
other's work and family
mm,
choices and feel like we can like assign support against it.
mm,
Because especially during the sort of sprint that was the last 6 months, I needed my husband to be doing pickups,
mm,
3 times
mm,
a week. And so are we both bought in? But then we will do, I will say that this is followed on by family meeting. Like we'll do admin meetings ahead of the week to figure out like who's doing what pickup. But at the top of a quarter, we'll say like, where are we? How are we like, where
just sort
from a
of
care
actual versus
infrastructure?
budget.
Yeah. Yeah. Like, do we
Yeah,
need to rein it in on
yeah.
something? Because we really do try and take those, they're not arbitrary numbers. Like, we really try and take those seriously. And it, in a way, it becomes gamified. Like,
Yeah.
he highlights the spreadsheet and he's like, this is where you are. And those Ubers, like, get cracking, you know? Well,
Right.
and so
Right.
there's a funness in it. I mean, we try, I'll tell you the other thing we do that's special for that annual meeting. We do it during the day.
Mm,
So while the kids are at school, he'll take off on a Friday.
mm.
And so we do it during the day. So we don't have like an extra sitter that evening. And we make it special. It's like we'll try and do something as like a treat around it. So we'll
Hmm.
do like the work part and then the play part on the other side.
Hey, Carl here. This section is gold. I love these wide ranging conversations, but it's also so helpful when we talk about practical, tactical things we can do to have better conversations about money, especially with a spouse or partner. And here, Neha walks us through the annual January money meeting she holds with her husband. But this isn't just about budget spreadsheets, and it sounds like there were plenty of them. It's about aligning values. They take the time to shift categories, reallocate money, and talk about what actually matters to them this year. It's not just a tool, as you'll see. It's not just a tool for managing money, it's a practice for living on purpose. Do you have, I mean, it's clear that you have no problem expressing your opinion about things.
Hmm.
But do you have any advice for people who may find those meetings intimidating? Like, there's often one spouse that might love the spreadsheet, comes a little bit armed with data and numbers. And then sometimes there's one spouse that feels like they just get run over. And it's not always
Mm-hmm.
gender specific, which is why I'm being careful. But for the spouse, in maybe even in your experience or in
Yeah.
experiences with people you've seen, for the spouse, it sometimes feels like they're on the defensive, they're getting run over. Like, is there a way, any suggestions you have for, I don't want to use the word standing up for yourself, but making your
Yeah.
opinion known in those meetings?
I would send, if there was like any materials, I know it sounds contrived, but usually you are reviewing some sort of budget or some sort of like planning
Mm,
piece. I often feel like the people who are, a little bit more reserved in conversation benefit from seeing material beforehand and
like a
like
little prep
being
briefing
like
document.
prepping themselves and
Mm,
deciding what they care about and
mm,
maybe also going first
mm,
in the conversation and
mm, mm,
saying um, I think written a lot of people worry about like putting things in email, but this is your marriage. It's not like a big bad corporation. I think that's the other piece to remember. Like this is your partnership. This is for the betterment of your partnership to feel better. And I think starting with that is like at the end of this conversation,
mm,
I want to feel safe. I want to feel like we are aligned on these three things, right?
mm,
Whatever those are. I think going in knowing that you're on the same team, having a chance to look at it beforehand, writing out your points if that's helpful. Like it's okay for things to take a little, like to feel uncomfortable. I think to the point of this is new. It's new for all of us. I
mm,
think
mm,
scripts are wildly important because otherwise we
mm,
word vomit.
mm,
I certainly did the first time, I used the example of what do you do when someone asked me that for the first time. I definitely sounded like an idiot and like had to practice because it
mm,
was new. Transitions are hard. So I think there's no shame in being able to say, these were some of the things that were on my mind that I want to think about.
Mhm.
These are the things I like already can feel defensive of. Like I want you to just know I feel nervous about it, because it just sort of signals
Mm.
to your partner who is on your side, like, oh, maybe I need to. Because I will tell you that I may sound like this, but I can be my husband is even more intense than I am. And
Mhm.
so, I would say, like, just try not to be condescending. Like, I didn't say that, but like, try about the Ubers, just know that I am trying. And I would
Mm.
almost get ahead of it because I knew it was going to come
Wow.
up.
That's super smart. It's interesting. I wrote one of the emails that we sent out to subscribers years ago. I said, I just asked a question like, is it challenging for you to talk about money with your
Mm,
spouse? Just reply yes or no. It was just a super simple
yeah.
email. And it went out to 50,000 people. And I got a whole bunch of responses. I was reading them and I'm set aside a couple hours. I'm reading through them and I get to one and I didn't look at who sent it. And it said, yeah, it's really hard because I often feel defensive, like I spent too much. And then it was it
Hmm.
said signed the spouse. And I looked up and I was like, it was my wife's email address. And I was like,
Oh my
oh,
God.
that's
Oh,
fascinating. It sounds like I have a bunch of work to do. And
yeah.
what we've uncovered is one of the things that came out of that was the timeout rule. And I think it's so interesting for you to be so comfortable in calling it out where you said, hey, I'm feeling, I think you said anxious or
Hmm.
worried about this,
Hmm.
like the ability to call out an emotional response. And one of the things I think that's really important in these conversations is you should expect it to be like, here's the dilemma. Like, it's one thing to grab an electric fence when you know it's electric.
Right. Right.
It's a completely different experience to grab one that you don't know is electric. And we often
Hmm.
go into these conversations like it's spreadsheets, it's math. Like, it's not, we need to understand. And I think anybody who's been in a relationship in any form where money plays any role has quickly gone into one of those situations that are like, whoa, you're like, I thought this was just math.
Yeah. Oh, we
It
all know
turns
it's
out,
not just math.
yeah. And so don't be surprised and build that into the sort of rules of engagement, if you will, where you can say, hey, you know what, I'm really interested in this emotional reaction I'm having right now. And I mean, I could never say, my wife can, I'm just become hijacked.
Oh,
And
really?
she'll have to remind me. She'll be like, hey, outside, like go on a
Wow.
run.
Yeah.
We'll
Yeah.
reengage in a bit. But the ability to either partner to call time out, to not be surprised when there's an emotional response. Like
Hmm.
for me, it still comes up like, am I going to end up like, my uncle or my dad or like whatever
Yeah.
those
Yeah.
stories are. So it's really interesting to hear that come
But
out.
even that, like, that's so deep. I think I mean, the framing of what are the fears? Like, it can be
Mm,
such a fascinating getting to know one another,
mm-hmm.
right? I think money can sometimes come from a place of control. Like, this is the thing we can control.
Yeah.
And so when you have two people, it is harder to control without controlling one another. And that's where it feels so delicate.
Yeah.
And I think
Yeah.
giving it space to say it's going to take some time, right? Like when we started this, it didn't feel the same as I can talk about it now, right?
Sure. Sure.
And so time, but having language and giving it space to figure it out.
Yeah. Well, just let's end with maybe just one or two rapid fire questions.
Mm,
Talking about fear, what's one thing about money that still scares you?
mm. That that I will use it unwisely.
Huh.
Yeah,
Just tell me
I
a
I
little bit
think
more
a
about that.
lot about my spending. I think a lot about, is this real value? Is this
Huh.
really valuable? I will overthink spending to the
Hmm.
extreme. Um, I think about it a lot in building this movement and in this business where, is like, I think in some ways people who have a more loose grip on money to feel like, oh, it's flowing. It's okay. Like, I'll make some mistakes. I won't make some mistakes. Like, it's okay. I I ruminate on sort of, oh, I wasted, X on
Mm,
that at Y.
mm,
And I, I think a little bit of that's probably healthy, and a little bit of it is hopefully not something I pass down to my children.
mm. Yeah, I wish we had another hour to talk about that one,
Yeah.
right? But that's
Yeah.
great. Tell me, how do you think about enough financially? How do you think about enough?
Choice. I
Mm,
think the
love that.
ability to make choices
Yeah, that freedom thing
that are
from earlier.
aligned with our real values is I think it's a gift to not feel like you're forced into anything.
Yeah, no, that's great, and totally makes sense based on this entire
Mhm.
conversation.
Mhm.
Um, so Neha, just to wrap up, I want you to pretend like I'm still doing this show in
Mm.
25 years, and I have your daughter on who's 7 now, so she would now be 32,
Mm.
and I ask her what she learned from her mom about money. What would you hope she would say at age 32?
Mm. To use your privilege, to use privilege wisely, to not punish yourself for privilege, but to use it to help
Mm.
other people as much as possible.
Can you tell me just a little bit more? Why does that?
Hmm.
What is that? What comes up?
I think that, I think that there's a lot of our, so of this work is, I've had to tiptoe around that dance of privilege, like choose my language so carefully. And I'm so aware of how much we hold back. And I think about myself, as sort of a young mom who didn't get help, right? In
Mm.
those sort of those years because I didn't, even though I had the privilege to, right? And I think um, this idea of it's okay to have, it's okay to have access to things. Not everyone will have access to it. You don't have to punish yourself for it. You can enjoy those gifts and try to do right by them, right? And be conscious of them, be real aware that you have them.
Yeah, that tension is so real and interesting to me. The idea of like, can I be unapologetic and very careful at the
And
same time?
without being an asshole, right? Like I think,
Exactly.
yeah, I think that
Yeah.
there's a real line there. There's a real
Yeah.
line, because you do want to raise children who want to work hard and feel like they've earned their life, and also know that maybe they have certain privileges to be able to do things that others may not be able to do, take risks that others may not be able to do,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
that's okay. That's
Yeah.
okay. uh, it's a lot of I mean, it's so generational. There's that someone shared with me a quote that a grandfather was a farmer, so their son could be a banker, so their son could be an artist, right?
Mm.
And there's such an interesting commentary on sort of our economy and sort of how that interplay with generations and expectations and our relationship to work.
Mm.
I feel like I'm just thinking about that one.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Neha, thanks so much for this conversation. It was just as lovely as I expected it. Thank you.
Thank you.
And that, my friends, wraps up another conversation about money. Thanks for listening to 50 Fires, a podcast about money and purpose. And I'm particularly grateful to Neha for this conversation, for her generosity, the real talk, and the tactical tools. And as always, if you know somebody who would benefit from this conversation, please don't hesitate to share it with them. You know, the little share button right there on your phone. Just send it to a friend, a family member, a colleague. Until next time, thanks for listening.
The views, information, or opinions expressed in the series are solely those of the individuals involved and do not necessarily represent those of Chip and Joanna Gaines, Binel Audio, nor Magnolia.